The history of Australian art is one of those subjects that has required a new book for quite a long time. The last full-scale history was Bernard Smith's book Australian Painting, which came out in the early 1960s. Since then we've had, well, straight away Bob Hughes' small book The Art of Australia, and then small books again by Christopher Allen and Andrew Sayers in that order. Now, none of those books are more than about 30 to 35,000 words. When I set out to do The Art of Australia, which was intended originally as a book to follow on from the Bob Hughes book for another publisher, the publisher I was working with, I very swiftly began to realise didn't really want anything more than another short, sharp quickie. And as I got into the subject, I realised there was much more there. So it was something that actually deserved a very thorough account. When Bob Hughes and Bernard Smith did their books back in the 60s, and late 50s in Bernard's case, there were only a handful of books they could draw on. There had been very little proper research done by a lot of the great Australian artists. There were books of reminiscences and letters, but there was very little that we think of as genuine art history. A lot of that stuff simply wasn't looked at and done in any depth. So the idea was to do a book which brought together all of the existing scholarship, which is considerable. There have been monographs on almost all the major Australian artists. There have been major exhibitions on almost all those artists, and there have been big survey shows such as Golden Summers, Australian Impressionism, so on and so forth. And so for me, who professionally has to work his way through this material anyway, who has to write about these shows and has been doing so for the best part of 30 years, it was a logical thing to move on and to put it all together into what I really see as one massive work of synthesis. To tell the story of Australian art from go to woe, to tell it as fluently as I could, and to try and get my facts straight. So it's a book which tries to combine a certain amount of scholarly endeavour with, and also, I hope, an accessible writing style. I've worked and worked and worked to polish it, to get it to the stage where it's a book that can be read not just by art academics, but by indeed anybody who picks up the book with an interest in the subject. It is, in a small way, a kind of a Manning Clark history for Australian art, although I assume it differs in many significant ways from what Manning Clark did. But at least the size and the scope of it is trying to do a more definitive work and try and deal with the subject in a depth which hasn't been dealt with before. Now, since it's come out, I've got a very interesting range of responses, and in fact it's an interesting thing to put out a book because it really helps you to learn who your friends aren't. I've had some tremendously good responses from people like Betty Churcher and Patrick McCackey. On the other hand, I've had a slew of quite extraordinarily spiteful reviews from people who I suppose you could describe as academics. Although I have to say that I don't think academic should be a term of abuse, and I'm afraid that the behaviour of some people really does do that for the word. I feel as though if I were given a book to review, which has been 10 to 12 years in the making, which is attempting to cover a subject in an accessible way, attempting to do something which really hasn't been done properly by anybody for a very long time, even if I hated it, I'd be a little bit more willing to come to the party than some of the things that I've found. So what it says to me is there is still a very great gap out there between the way that art is looked at and dealt with in the institutions and the way that art is met with by the general public. I think as a newspaper critic of long standing, I've really been in betwixt and between of that for a very long time, and this book is the result of that. So when people want to be particularly mean about me when they're writing reviews, they say things like, "Oh, a journeyman journalist," or the journalist, of course, is the universal term of abuse for people who consider themselves to be much higher and mightier than that. But tell the truth, I'm actually rather a reluctant journalist. I've written very few things that one would call journalism over the last 20-odd years. Most of what I do are reviews, opinion pieces, columns. When I came back to Australia from living overseas for about 4 years, my original request of John Alexander, who was the Herald editor in those days, was that I'd like to write something that was more like an essay and less like a review, and he simply said go for it. So I was able to write something that was almost 3,000 words a week, which is a considerable size for an art column. Now it's back to about 1,500. But still, with those columns and with what I write, I always think that it's important that you do the best job you can with everything, that you do as thorough a job as you can, that you draw on your knowledge and your resources, that you keep reading, you keep looking. And this History of Australian Art is really a culmination of all those things. It's not written as a column, it's not written as journalism, it's not written as in a magazine style. I believe that it's written in a totally different style. It's written in a style which, at least from my point of view, approximates history.